Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be in Adair County where apparently we still stand for the pledge and we're allowed to have a prayer in a public space. How about that? I've got good news and bad news from Washington. The good news is we're no longer going to be sending stimulus checks to dead people. Yeah, you laugh, but we sent 1.1 million dead people checks last summer, over $1 billion. So I introduced a bill, and it's not easy to pass a bill, but sometimes if it's non-controversial, like stopping checks to dead people, sometimes it can get through unanimously. So I went to the floor, and we were getting it through. Actually, a Democrat got on board, and we had bipartisanship for a change, and we were going forward with the bill, and this other senator was coming to the floor. He was going to object. Well, we still don't know why, but he never showed up, and he never showed up. And so the Democrat people on the floor were saying to the Democrat senator that was with me, they're saying, you have to object. And he says, I'm not going to object to my own bill. I'm not going to object to sending, eliminating the sending of checks to dead people. He says, I won't do it. So there was no one there, and it actually passed. So it passed the Senate, but then this guy comes running through the door, this senator from another state. He says, stop, I object. But he was too late. It was actually kind of comical. But he then blocked it in the House. And so it didn't pass. So the good news is it finally did pass. We're no longer going to do it, but it's going to take your federal government 3 years to figure out how not to send checks to dead people. They said it's complicated, and they said I wouldn't understand. And I said, well, I do understand. I understand incompetence when I see it, and that's what it is, incompetence. It's going to take them 3 years to figure out how not to send checks to dead people. How are things going as far as the virus? I think you can tell things are doing better. I saw a statistic this morning, 85% of people over 65 have been vaccinated. That's pretty darn good. And people say, oh, well, 15% haven't. Well, it's like 85% have. That's good news. One of the things I think we could do, and I've been advocating for, is I think your local doctor ought to be allowed to have the vaccine. Think about it. If you're a little hesitant and you say, I'm not so sure about taking the vaccine, but your family doctor had it, you might maybe talk to them and have a conversation if you've been going to them for 20 or 30 years. In Bowling Green, one of the big medical clinics still has no vaccine from their doctors. You can get it at CVS or Walgreens, which is fine. I'm for that, so more people can get it quicker. But I think also if you were hesitant getting it from your local doctor, a few more people would get it. I think that when we look at this, though, we need to look at this and use our ability to think and that we're all not in the same boat. The young kids here are not the same as people over 80. If you say they're all the same, people are going to quit listening to you, particularly the young people, because you're lying to them. We should be honest. This is a disease where primarily, not entirely, but almost all the deaths came from people after a certain age. 65 and over, you can probably say 90% of the disease. The other interesting thing they haven't been telling you is it's not only age, it's also weight. Really isn't a race predilection. The media gets into that, it affects different races. It affects people who weigh different amounts. And so people who are overweight have a tougher time with this. People struggle. I know of a young man who was only 41 who got it, and he got sicker and sicker and sicker, didn't go to the hospital, and he ended up on a ventilator for 9 days, and he survived, but he was overweight. And that was his number one risk factor. 41 is not a risk factor, but being overweight is. But here's another thing that Dr. Fauci won't tell you, because he's too busy telling you a lot of nonsense, but he won't tell you this, which is very good advice. If you get COVID, or if someone in your family gets COVID, and they're either overweight or over a certain age, probably over 40 and overweight, probably together, when you begin to cough, everybody knows what bronchitis is like. If you've had the flu and you have that sort of dry cough, it's in your lungs at that point. You need to get treated before rather than later. Why? Because they have a treatment. President Trump got it. Chris Christie got it, and so did Giuliani. They got it within 24 hours. It's called monoclonal antibodies. They've made these antibodies in an artificial way that react to the virus. Remember they talked about taking antibodies from people who had the infection and giving it to people? That kind of worked, but it's complicated and it isn't as easy. Now they can manufacture those antibodies. So they have antibodies to the virus. It's like taking an antibiotic, and it kills off quite a bit of the virus, and you don't get it as bad. I have a family member who had metastatic cancer. She got COVID, and she has almost no immune system, and she survived by getting the monoclonal antibodies. But this is something that's important because there's a window of time. If you wait too long and you're too sick, you can't get the monoclonal antibodies and they don't work. So that's one bit of advice, public service announcement, that if you know somebody gets sick and they're beginning to cough and get a little worse, don't wait till they're on death's door. Get them in, and there is a treatment that we can get them. Now, as far as the regulations and what we do and how we treat this, I'm a big believer that in a free country, each individual makes their own mind up. So there's some... So there's some people who have masks on and some people who don't. It's up to the individual. And each individual has different risk factors, and so they should make their decision accordingly. And I think that's a good thing. There's also a difference between young and old. There's a difference between your, body mass, etc. There's a lot of differences between individuals. And so I think we make those decisions. And so with a vaccine, I'm for it, but I would persuade you and not command that you take it. It's a persuasion. You can accept it or reject it, but I would persuade you. It's sort of like church goes. If I were governor, as opposed to the current governor, I probably would have said if you're overweight and over a certain age, I probably wouldn't be in a closed setting for a long period of time when the disease was rampant and there was no vaccine. I think the disease is on the decline, and I think it's reasonable to start gathering again. But I would not command that you not go to church. I would not command that you close your schools down. This is wrong, and at every turn the courts have rebuked our governor. And I want to thank Senator Wise, raise your hand, Senator Wise, and the state legislature for saying to the governor that you can't close our churches, you can't close our schools, and really any of these emergency edicts should be reviewed by the state legislature. Think about the checks and balances. Congress doesn't have all the power, President doesn't have all the power, the judiciary doesn't. You have these checks and balances. But we have a problem, and I think this is another problem. I don't know where Senator Wise is on this, but I think we need to allow the legislature the power to call themselves back into session. He's given a thumbs up on that. Think about it this way. When the kings of old would dissolve Parliament, they dissolved Parliament so they could have all the power. And then they would prevent Parliament from convening. We've done it by law. In Kentucky, the legislature cannot convene except for at designated times. So the governor last March started making all these edicts. You can't go to church. You can't go to church school. He said you couldn't travel outside the state. He had mandatory quarantine. He had all these rules that really I don't think he had the power to do it. The legislature in the 90s gave him emergency powers. And these emergency powers were like, if a tornado hit your community this week, I'm all for the National Guard bringing in blankets and water and food. That's an emergency. But saying you can't go to a restaurant or you can't go to a church or you can't go to a hotel or a bowling alley or a gym or a hair salon is something that no one individual should be able to make that decision. Why? Because one individual might be wrong and they might not represent you very well. But if it has to go through the legislature as well, at least there's some check and balance to that. Now, I would object to the legislature closing everything down too, but there would be a check and a balance. So they came back in session and they voted on restrictions. And their restrictions said that basically after 30 days, the edicts of the governor telling you what to do expire unless approved by the legislature. So what did the governor do? He immediately sued the state legislature in court, and he's arguing this. He's arguing that he has inherent powers, I guess from God. God anointed him somehow, and he has these powers that aren't in the Constitution, but they're inherent, and they are his powers, and he can tell you what to do no matter what the state legislature. He's trying to strike down a law of the state legislature that simply modified the emergency powers that the state legislature gave him. This should be laughed out of court, but they've already had a liberal judge in Frankfurt that's given an injunction. So while I think none of his edicts have any power of law because the state legislature hasn't approved them, he says they still do, even though the law says they don't. So they're fighting this out in court, and this is going to happen in June. I think this will be the most important legal case of our lifetime. But I'm fearful about which way they go. But I'm also here to tell you that the Supreme Court is an elected position. We've elected these people, and 4 of them will be up in November of 2022, and you need to watch this carefully. Because if the court rules or they vote that the state legislature cannot check the power of the governor, that is a recipe for unlimited power. You hear on all the television channels they were calling Donald Trump an authoritarian. hogwash. This would be authoritarianism. This would be allowing a governor, and I don't care which party they're in, I'm not for a Republican or a Democrat, having the power to make the rules for your entire life with no check and balance between the state legislature. But this is going to go before the Supreme Court in June. This is a big deal, and it is about your freedoms. And people say, well, gosh, isn't it unwise, and wasn't it unwise last year to be 80-year-olds in a church for 2 hours? My suggestion to you would be not to do it. Wear a mask, don't do it, be spread out, maybe be outside, but I would not command that. So there's a difference between an edict from government and persuasion. There's no reason we can't have common sense and agree to some common sense things, but we cannot have the government dictating when and where you can go to church. As far as where are we going as a country, I'm very, very concerned about how much debt we're piling on. Maybe $8 trillion, $7 to $8 trillion.